I am the Director of Innovation at the Reynolds Journalism Institute in Columbia, Missouri at the Missouri School of Journalism. I'm now going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves, and then we will go straight into a few questions. So Gabe, would you like to start?
Sure. I am Gabe Schneider, and I am a journalist, formerly the Washington correspondent at MinnPost and the assistant managing editor at VoteBeat. And these days, I am the lead editor at The Objective and a columnist for RJI.
Thank you. Cece?
Hey, everybody. I'm Cece Wei. I'm currently the director of programs at Open News, where we just launched the DEI Coalition yesterday. Before that, I was the assistant managing editor at ProPublica.
Great. And Karen?
Hi. Thanks for having me on this panel. I was most recently the global finance and economics reporter at Quartz, and I am the incoming business of sustainability reporter at Business Insider.
Great. And looks like Kendra is just popping in.
We could all laud Kendra. I could write her own bio. Like,
yeah,
Kendra
you want to introduce Kendra while her computer catches up?
Kendra is, an exemplary climate reporter. She's like, oh, I'm gonna jump in before Karen.
I could not find my headset. Apologies. It's a day. My name's Kendra Pierre-Lewis, and I'm a senior climate reporter with the Gimlet Spotify podcast, How to Save a Planet. And I guess germane to this discussion, prior to this, I was a climate reporter with the New York Times.
Thank you so much. All right, so we're going to start with, I've gotten a few emails with questions. We're going to start with some questions from me for the panelists. Panelists, when you would like to answer something, just wave at me so I know, and I can call on you. And then if you are listening today, please use the Q&A option to write questions that you would like the panelists to answer, and I will be also reading those questions for them, and they can answer questions from all of you in attendance today. So first, we'll start with the term anti-racist. Let's talk a little bit about what it means for newsrooms to do this work. Gabe, can you please explain this term a little bit for those in attendance who may not be familiar with it?
Sure. So I think anti-racism is rooted in abolitionist struggle, right? But the term was popularized more recently by Professor Ibram X. Kendi as a way to delineate between those who are actively challenging racism and those who are simply sort of allowing systems of oppression to function. And those folks might, call themselves not racist, right, rather than anti-racist. And in the case of newsrooms, that delineation can be quite effective in challenging newsroom practices that are rooted in white supremacy. An example could be barring Black reporters from covering, Black Lives Matter protests because of their supposedly unfair bias, or telling reporters to shy away from race when, writing about politics, despite the fact that white racial grievance has been a primary theme of American politics throughout the country's history. So it's sort of a primer.
All right, thank you. So recently, we've seen a lot of examples of how journalists of color are being treated differently in newsrooms. And the most recent example, we all saw AAJ talking about how Asian journalists were being told that they are seen as biased for covering that tragedy. So what would be your advice for journalists of color who need to address this issue in their newsrooms with their colleagues or editors? How can they navigate that conversation? Karen?
So I always go back to business. I say, explain it almost like as a competitive advantage. Like AAJ was very specific in the language of its examples regarding things like people with knowledge of the Atlanta area and the surrounding neighborhoods. They had proficiency in the Korean language, in their ability to communicate with the family members and friends of many of the victims. And I think also the understanding regarding Korean culture or the history in which Korean Americans often are in a position where they are working or owning businesses, which research has shown, what is the context behind why they were more likely to own these businesses that were unable to switch to remote work during the pandemic. And so I think that is really explaining it just like anything else, like a beat, like parents with experience navigating the public versus the private school system, people who have experience, in other fields like science or in business, really understanding and explaining that experience on a cultural basis or geographic experience. I would say quite plainly, like a white person with knowledge of the Boston area after the Boston bombings, was not seen as a bias. That was seen as a real advantage to understanding the geography in which the route of the marathon even took place and where the bombings were able to hurt the most number of people. So I think that's one way to explain it. The other one is saying very plainly, if you don't allow these journalists to cover this story, what is being lost as a result? Is it the nuance? Is it the context? Is it the inability to really speak to the family members and friends in a way that is sensitive? And also, I think for a long time, we've had this discussion about really respecting people who have language abilities and how those have been taken for granted in newsrooms for a really long time in a way that I think can be non-reflective of the changing demographics of the United States.
All right. Would anyone else like to speak to that?
I think the other thing that you need to realize or recognize is that oftentimes white editors, are coming from this position where any discussion of race or racial bias, all they're going to hear is that you're calling them racist. And so they're not going there. That is a barrier that you are going to have to get past before they're willing to sort of digest anything that you are saying. And that if, broadly speaking, you're in a newsroom that you want to have growth in, that you have to recognize that it's a marathon and not a sprint. And you are unfortunately going to have to pick which of these battles that you make, and you're going to take on. You're not going to, you will exhaust yourself out turning every single one of these incidences, and there will likely be many, into like your fight, or into like your putting your line in the sand. And so you're going to have to learn how to pick and choose when you're going to raise it. And over time, the best way to raise it with a given editor or a given person, it would be lovely if you could just be really rational and have them hear it, but that doesn't work in my experience.
All right, thank you. So on the other side of that, how can news leaders in newsrooms help shift their culture to respect and utilize their journalists of color without assuming their bias and without putting the burden of the education and culture shift on them? Because we don't want them to be responsible for having to educate everyone in the newsroom either. So for editors who do want to do this work but don't know how to start, what would you guys suggest to them?
Hire people. They're like, I'm at a point now where people will ask me to do things to help them with diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I know none of those things. I'm just Black, right? Like being Black does not make me an expert in how to diversify your institution. There are people whose job it is that are really good at it, that are designed to help you figure out how to overcome those barriers. And if you are actually committed to doing this work, you need to pay those people, and you need to put them in positions of power within the institution where they have hiring and firing capability, so that the editor that everybody knows is racist does not continue to get promoted because he's buddies with somebody 3 doors down and nobody wants to fire him.
Or nobody's willing to tell you about it because they know that they will get in trouble for it.
Exactly.
And to like build on what Kendra said too, I think a common theme that I've been seeing a lot in leadership right now is this struggle of I don't want to say the wrong thing, and so I'm not going to say anything, right? Because there is a paralysis situation, right? And I think for me, the number one thing that you need to do, and Kendra gave an excellent example, something you can do, is be proactive. Like what your staff is waiting for is to see you do something that they didn't prompt, right? Because that shows a step of commitment that you have. And it's like, it's okay to say like, I'm figuring this out and I'm learning and I may say the wrong thing right now, but I'm going to say something because it's important to me. Whatever, like in the example that we had right now, you could say things like, the status quo is not okay, right? Like making a statement that says like, whatever the problem is not okay to me, and I'm going to try to figure out how to fix it. And then I think the point about putting the burden of education on POC staff is really important one, just because like it's so common, right? Like I feel like if you're a POC in a newsroom, like you've probably experienced this at some point, if not constantly. And I think the hardest part, I think, for leaders is like, if they thought about it, it's like, I don't want to put the burden on folks, but I don't know who to ask. And I think in those cases, one, they're the excellent paid people that Kendra mentioned. They're also like so much good reading material that has been put out there. And like, as we have mentioned at the top of the webinar as well, right? When Gabe explained anti-racism, right? Ibram X. Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, is a great place to start. They're also like, you know, the top 10 books, whatever lists that have come out, like just read them all. And I guarantee that you will be in a different spot than you were before you were reading. And it will help inform your thoughts on like, what do I say? How do I say it? How do I express myself and what I'm thinking in a way that is thoughtful and considerate of others?
Great. Karen or Gabe? Yes, Karen?
I was going to say there's two things which when it comes to very specifically is lifting the burden of uncertainty, to follow up what CC was saying. Like a lot of journalists of color don't know what is safe to talk about or safe to bring up at newsrooms, either because of their past experiences or because they don't know what is the culture regarding discussing even what happened in Atlanta. And so I think as newsroom leaders, you can lift that burden of uncertainty, and so that your non-white staff feel like they're not just navigating in the dark regarding like what they can talk about, what they can pitch. And like you said, like proactively, Cece, I love that, like proactively stating, you know, like we think it's really important to think about like who we're quoting as sources, you know, the way that we're framing stories, the way that we are possibly doing initiatives to reach out and translate our stories into like non-English languages, you know, those kinds of initiatives where you're proactively saying, if you have thought about this, then I think, you know, this is something that leadership is also invested in doing, not just in the short term in reaction to a major news event. And then the other thing that I think is really, really important is giving people agency. That helps avoid tokenizing people, is because often the way to avoid one person feeling like they are responsible for an entire ethnicity group or racial group, or even having the burden of getting involved in the story because they may have an experiential or a cultural relationship, is just asking and then not punishing them if they don't have the capacity to deal with that on top of their job, especially if what they cover is unrelated to the topic at hand. So I think that's really, really important, because I think asking for acknowledging agency is really, really important, especially in an industry where we're often told, you know, like, be prepared to work long hours, be prepared to not earn a lot of money. I think giving that extra room, and also really taking it to heart as a newsroom leader, not to punish people for not wanting to overextend themselves, because the mental health burden is so large right now for so many non-white journalists, I think is really, really important, and really holding themselves to account for doing so, and understanding that if you're tempted to be like, oh, but it would be really good if you participate, like just back off, just think about it for a second, and then also acknowledge like, who can you reach out to? Does it mean like hiring more people? Does it mean reminding them that it's okay to take their paid time off? Or, you know, is it looking in your budget for hiring freelancers in the community who have been recently laid off and could, you know, appreciate the work? And also extending that to other people in the newsroom, right? Like there are probably people on the business side who would love to write about these topics who normally don't have those opportunities. Freelancers, you know, like in layout or in your photography and graphics departments, all of those components are really, really important. And also getting buy-in from non-white journalists who are involved in things like audience development. You know, how are they thinking about creatively reaching out to these communities, which often aren't a priority when it comes to disseminating this kind of crucial news information.
Great, thank you. And we do have a question that touches on what you were just talking about. Kristen asked, at what point does using a reporter who has lived expertise turn into tokenism? Is that just a case-by-case basis? Is it, I guess they're asking, like, when does it cross that line for?
I think I can just reiterate what Karen said. I think giving reporters the agency to do that work is really important, and not just going up to them and saying, you are the representative of this group. You must do the work in this respect. That's not the way to do it, right? But giving folks the agency when they have the time and space and energy to actually do that work is really important.
Great, thank you. All right. So we'll talk a little bit about social media. Originally, that's how this conversation got inspired. So let's talk a little bit about how journalists are encouraged to act or seem objective on their social media. As a result, a lot of POC journalists are often reprimanded when they tweet something that relates to their personal lived experiences, their race, or their gender. So how can newsrooms change their social media policies or be more aware of how they're enforcing this double standard to treat all their journalists fairly? Do you guys have suggestions on what these newsrooms can do to change the way they're reacting?
I mean, I feel like part of the problem is in many cases, the people who are enforcing the standards are relatively affluent white men. And and one of the things that I think is especially cute, I think it's especially cute when it comes to race, kind of in order of operations, it's race, and then I think it's gender, and then I think it's class. When you raise these issues, people in positions of power and authority often conflate their discomfort with bias. So if they read something and they don't like it, it makes them feel uncomfortable in some way. Their knee-jerk reaction is that it must be biased, instead of taking a beat and asking themselves, where is this comfort coming from? What is this thing actually saying? This is my science journalism coming through, but like, is there evidentiary support for the thing that they are saying? I get in trouble for a tweet. It's actually kind of hilarious. I get in trouble for a tweet thread that an editor at the Times liked enough to put in the paper, and then the standards editor saw the tweet once it was published in the paper and decided that it was biased and that I was stating opinion. But every single thing that I tweeted with a link back to underlying support. It was factual. It just made the standards editor uncomfortable, because what I was tweeting about was the way in which media elevates white supremacists and gives them a platform. And so I don't know how you tell, I don't know what standard you can create that allows people to essentially come down on you based on their own models of discomfort. And I don't have the lived experience to have gone through my life without being made to feel uncomfortable by other people, and not have to interrogate where that discomfort was coming from, so I can disentangle whether I'm feeling uncomfortable for reasons that I need to fix in myself versus someone is making me uncomfortable because they're being racist or sexist or some other kind of problematic behavior. I don't know how you fix people so that they recognize that difference. Sorry, that was kind of ranty.
No.
But like fundamentally, that's because there's no like underlying all of these social media standards is that there has to be somebody who implements them. So in many cases, I mean, there are kind of two threads. One is that the standards are so vaguely written that anyone that any application is arbitrary and capricious, but sometimes the standards are pretty tightly written, but you're still running afoul of people because they just don't like you, or they don't like the things that you're tweeting, even if they are factual.
Makes sense. Karen, did you want to add something?
I always go back to thinking about what standards have changed in newsrooms and what standards have not. And the idea that it strikes me that social media policies have not evolved in the same way that like policies regarding I think back to history in terms of like the fighting that it took for women to, become reporters, or like smoking to be eliminated in newsrooms, or, finally there were greater discussions regarding pay gaps that we're still navigating right now, or parental leave policies. I think the thing that is, reporters have been encouraged to use social media long enough that this discussion that we're having is also tied to what Kendra said, which is this ongoing discussion regarding journalism's blind spots regarding things like race and class and geography, and even in terms of its the perception regarding View from Nowhere being often very US centric versus the rest of the world, right? Like there is literally a great site now called Rest of World that attempts to reframe stories because to acknowledge the fact that issues regarding especially technology and business have totally different frameworks in other parts of in non-US countries. And so I think that's really, really important to think about. And the other thing that Kendra is really smart at articulating is, I think, the idea in which discomfort versus bias, like every member of this panel knows what it's like to have to back up with extensive links and receipts and prior research for comments that they are perceived as having bias or personal opinions for, even after graduate educations or specializations in really, technical topics, whether it be data or, science or economics and politics. There's a lot of information that is quantifiable about the effects that these areas can have on women, on non-white individuals, on poor individuals. And even when we state something very plain that has been extensively researched by people in our respective industries, it is demoralizing for non-white individuals, especially on these beats, to consistently be told that what we are tweeting is biased when it has been backed up, and we spend our life doing this to communicate it properly and to basically tell other people that they're not overreacting to this, even though we are not white. Like, I think that's the thing that's really, really difficult when we talk about addressing newsroom leaders, is the thing that you need to keep in mind, and going back to the Q&A, the question regarding retention, is just like when we are tweeting this stuff, it is at a point where we feel like we can't express it any other way, or we've also tried expressing it in our work and it's not getting through. And so I think that's the thing, is when we talk about these social media policies, it is a way for us to communicate what we are learning in our jobs and also what we are talking about with our friends. And that and we find that it is the people who are following us on social media are also genuinely interested in this topic and are staying with us for this information, right? Like, and they trust us to communicate this information because of the way that we have done it before. And I think that's really, really important, is when we talk about social media policies and who gets punished or who gets reprimanded and who doesn't, it's a really basic demonstration of trust in the individual that you have hired, right? Like the four of us especially knew from like 10 years ago, we were told, if you tweet something, you better be prepared to defend it. You better be prepared for it to be on the front page of the New York Times. And all of us are experienced enough to know that if we've said something, we have thought about it very, very carefully, in some cases for several years. And I think when we talk to newsroom leaders, it's a basic demonstration of how much they are demonstrating a different standard of trust regarding often their non-white staff and the most outspoken non-white staff versus other individuals that they have granted different privileges and leeway to communicate other kinds of opinions.
Cece?
Yeah, I just wanted, so so much good ground has already been covered that I will not repeat those things. I think two points that I would want to tease out in addition to this is that, one, I think that regardless of the conversation about objectivity in modern day as a whole, the one thing that I will add on to what Kendra said as well is that this teasing out the specific concept of like that uncomfortableness comes from a place of objective, assuming the sort of white male perspective, right? And it is that is like in practice how things sort of work culturally separate from the concept of objectivity. It's what it's like turned into, and that's what builds into like, this is an objective because it doesn't fall under my assumptions in this bucket and that perspective that I've had in my life, right? But then the other thing about like, what would we love to see in social media policies? I'm not a social media policy expert in any way, but one thing that occurs to me that I would love to see, touching on the point of like enforcement, is that I would love for newsrooms to have a transparent social media enforcement policy with clearly laid out assumptions that whoever is doing the enforcement needs to think about first. Because touching on Karen's point of how demoralizing it is to have to sort of back things up so extensively, the way I would describe it, right, and I think this is language that people are using already, so it's not my language, which is that you are often asking POC reporters to essentially existentially prove their existence and their validity as human beings who experience things, right? And that kind of ask or burden is completely unfair, and a thing that no one would ever be asked to do if that's how you described what was happening. And so having a social media enforcement policy saying that you would never sort of like before taking any action, taking that into consideration and making sure that none of your actions put that into question, right, I think would be a really great place to start.
So in a related question, one attendee asked, can any of you think of any newsrooms that have established good standards or guidelines that have worked well in lifting the uncertainty around how they enforce their social media policies? Are there any good examples out in the industry that people can look at?
I mean, I'm in a weird circumstance right now because I'm no longer in a newsroom. I work for a podcasting company that's owned by a tech company. And anyone who has been on my social media since like May of last year when I started, freedom is amazing. I don't think I've become any more quote unquote biased. Our social media policies are pretty normal. Like basically I'm not supposed to attack my colleagues, which I like them, so I wouldn't. And I think I'm not supposed to disparage the company, maybe, I'm not even sure. The biggest difference for me is there's nobody tracking my social media behavior. So essentially I would have to do something pretty egregious that attracted a ton of attention that then openly reflected back on the company that they felt that they had to be compelled to do something about it, if that makes any sense. I mean, I don't know offhand what that would be, but that's kind of like the threshold. Whereas at my last employer, you were actually being monitored. So it's a very different relationship with social media, which is like, I generally, you know, I'm not looking to go viral for all the wrong reasons. I don't think many journalists are. And I think that distinction between like, yeah, don't do things that attract so much attention that it gives our company negative attention is a very different dynamic from we are going to be monitoring your behavior. And if you step out of line, or we decide that you step out of line, you're going to be corrected in some way. And it's especially interesting because newsrooms are coming from this place of freedom of speech. Like literally, it's the Second Amendment that allows newsrooms to exist. And yet the way in which they monitor, many of them monitor social media, it's an authoritarian framework in which you are not allowed free speech. And we're, you know, reporters and even just people who work in news institutions are routinely being told, don't tweet, don't retweet. We saw that you liked this tweet. Can you go private now? Like it's a level of surveillance that is anti-ethical to the Second Amendment.
I can think of a couple newsrooms that I don't know if they have social media policies, but I do know that their leadership just respects the autonomy of the reporters and doesn't scrutinize in the way that Kendra's talking about. And I think, I don't know off the top of my head, Oakland Side is a great example of that. Sahan Journal is a great example of that, right? Like having the leadership actually respect and expect from you that you're going to tweet out things that are grounded and that are from your experience, and that you're going to be fair in the way that you tweet is a big thing, and just not, you know, always being scrutinized and always being watched.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to go, we're starting to get questions. So if you are here listening and watching today, please put your questions in the Q&A box and we will get to as many of them as possible. She says, how do you think it's best to bring up the idea of journalists of color being retained by newsrooms? I feel like a lot of newsrooms rely on freelancers and diverse staff on temporary contracts, which seems to speak to a wider issue of no long-term stability for POC. Karen?
I will say this as a former media reporter and also someone who covers business. So this is something that's really, really hard because it is tied to a larger question regarding like temporary work in the United States, and in even the discussions regarding like how often people of color are much more likely to do this work, you know, like the contract, no benefits. So like media, unfortunately, is not an outlier regarding this situation, and also the burden in which, so I think that is, it's both depressing and consoling, right? To know that media is not unique in how non-white individuals or Black and brown individuals are much more likely to be on temporary contracts or freelancers, because we've seen this in restaurants, we've seen this in hotels, we've seen this, you know, like Amazon is a classic example regarding this kind of financial and political instability. I think when it comes to, as someone who used to be a freelancer and was very cognizant of the situation, I think the thing to keep in mind is collective action. You know, the freelancers union is really working to acknowledge this, and their leadership is cognizant of this intersection between race and class and gender, and they're working on making conditions better for freelancers and contractors. I think there's also working with editors and building long-standing relationships so that systems change, not just for your own situation, but for others as well. And then really talking about encouraging unionization efforts that acknowledge the disproportionate burden on freelancers and contractors who are non-white. I think there's also been a lot of really exhausted tweets of people saying, you know, like Asian Americans, you can contact them the rest of the year when there isn't a mass shooting, or you can contact Black reporters and writers when, you know, outside of the George Floyd protests and Black Lives Matter, and recognizing, like I said, giving them agency. And as newsroom leaders, like not just reaching out to these people when it's an issue in regards to their race and their community, you know, like I said, thinking of them for other topics and other issues, and recognizing and rewarding their hard work. I think the thing, and also amplifying their work, you know, like doing audience engagements, recommending them. I have to say, I have to really give credit to the editors who said, who recommended me for well-paid, well-compensated, high-profile work when I was a freelancer. That kind of social currency is also really, really important. And editors are all friends with each other. So like doing that and also, you know, paying people fairly it really helps, right? Because there are people who choose to be freelancers for the freedom or for their own personal circumstances. And those people deserve fair wages and also fair treatment. And I think that's really, really important too. And so I think those are all of the things that people who have the power to change newsroom systems and the way that they operate. And then also as freelancers, you know, I think it's really important, like I said, because they don't have the stability or the benefits of being full-time. I think when we talk about social media policies, like I think really think about like, how does the newsroom, if you're applying the same newsroom standards to your freelancers and your contractors that you are to like full-time staff with salary and benefits, like that is often really unfair. And then often you have to think about that in terms of what is the purpose in doing so? Is it like a legal liability issue? Is it really about discomfort, personal discomfort at the level of the editors? Because these people often that is quite frankly, as a freelancer, it was my way of tweeting in order to get and to speak about my expertise or my perspective on an issue that led to freelance work. And so I think that's really, really important to think about when we're talking about these policies being a symptom of a much larger issue that should be discussed in newsrooms across the country and around the world.
All right. And a related question. Larissa asked if she should just have a job.
Wait,
Twitter-
Kendra had her hand up.
All right. I just wanted to add
sorry.
something to
Yeah, that's
what
it.
Karen said, which is that we are talking about social media policies and there's a reason for that, but to recognize that the social media policies are also a reflection and a manifestation of what's on the pages. And one of the things that is really problematic, I think, in the way media deals with race very often is that it often treats race as a distinct issue. So we're going to talk about Asian American racism right now in the wake of Atlanta. We're going to talk about anti-Black racism in the wake of George Floyd. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't sort of stitch it together into a cohesive whole into other parts of its reporting. And so I'm constantly thinking about the fact that Wesley Lowery got in trouble for a tweet where he pointed out in a New York Times story that on the Tea Party that they didn't talk at all about white racial grievance in that story. So he doesn't work at that. He did not at the time work at the Times. He worked at the Post. He got in trouble for factually pointing out a well-documented aspect of the Tea Party, but nobody paused and really hesitated or thought through like how was it possible that they could write so many words about the Tea Party and not at all talk about racial grievances in that piece, right? And that happens over and over again. And so one of the fallouts, I think, of hiring so many people of color as contract labor is their race is so contentious in newsrooms and they're in a precarious position. So they're not going to stand up and they're not going to say, we need to interject X, Y, and Z into our coverage, right? They're going to stay in their lane in the hope that they get promoted or they get a salary position because there's no benefit to speaking up in that context. So it diminishes the reporting as well.
If I could expand on that really quickly, it's a huge source of frustration to me. The discomfort that we were talking about earlier. It's interesting to me that there are stories like the one you pointed out and tweet threads and news analysis that sort of lack that discomfort for a lot of white editors and that have this giant hole in them where discussion of race should be. And those are the stories that get published. Those are the tweets that don't get challenged, right? Tweets that are in many cases wrong because they don't discuss race and they don't discuss sort of the central theme, like the thing that Wesley Lowery pointed out. So it's incredibly frustrating. I know that's just an extension on what you were saying, but.
All right. And Larissa asked, should she just have a work Twitter account and a personal Twitter account? Will that make a difference? Or is our companies going to watch both and try to control both anyway? What would you suggest for journalists as a way to, I guess, mitigate that?
I don't have Facebook, but I have Instagram and I have Twitter, and both of my accounts are public, and they're public for a very simple reason, which is I want to hold myself accountable. So I'm not, if there's something that I want to share, that's what group texts are for. That's what, but in a nutshell, if you become, and I'm not there yet, but I've seen it in other places, if you become big enough, someone's just going to screenshot your tweet. Like someone that you think you trust is in your private Twitter group is just going to screenshot whatever it is that maybe is funny in your in group but on your out group and share it. So like that's the thing that's my 2 cents. It's like it's not like it makes sense to me to have that separation. If you, like, a friend of mine has a very private Facebook and it's only family, and so she shares her family photos. So if that's why you want to make a separation between public and private, is because you want to share like very, like family photos and private things that you don't want out in the world, like go forth and do it. But if you're hoping to do it in the idea that you're going to escape scrutiny, it is very easy to screenshot things. And so I wouldn't do that for that regard. And that's why my social media handles are public. And also why I scrub everything and I do very little. And I only do Instagram stories. I very rarely do like posts because it's just too easy to take things out of context. It's too easy to make a snarky tweet in response to something, and the thing you're responding to has disappeared. And now you have this snarky tweet that looks horrific in some way, right? Like, so that's just the way I deal with social media.
Okay. Hold on. I just had it and it popped away.
Karen has something, I think.
Okay. So Emma asks, hi Emma. What about the related issues of digital security for journalists who are facing harassment and violence as a result of their social media use? Are any newsrooms doing a good job of supporting them and extending this support to freelancers?
So to follow, I saw that and then I saw it pop away. That was the one that I was looking to. I think following what Kendra said, the thing that is really difficult also about being non-white, and especially if you're a non-white woman, is that you go in knowing that you are extra vulnerable to harassment, regardless of what topics that you cover, especially when it's politics or tech, but it can also extend if you just go viral for something. And I mean, there is too much emphasis placed on personal responsibility, like knowing how to screenshot your notifications, knowing how to like deal with terrible people doxing your personal information, like your phone numbers and your personal address. But the thing about that is, going back to social media policies and what Kendra said, I think it's about saying very clearly it is an HR issue and it is a comms issue for saying, if this happens, we should issue a public statement that we are in support. You know, The Verge did a really good column saying very clearly how they needed to respond. Newsrooms should respond when there are bad faith attacks, when essentially there's a very prominent talk show that will, repeatedly blast a reporter for and place a very large explicit target on their back. How should newsrooms respond? What is and what that means for the morale of anybody else looking to do that kind of investigative, critical work of, a really political topic. I think that's really, really important. And to Emma's point, and what Kendra said, I have been on several panels where people have asked me if I have thought about doing a personal versus private account. But at the same time, I want to make it very explicit about everyone who knows me knows I have very loud values. It's why Kendra and I are such great friends. But I think it's also about those values have also drawn people into my work in a way that I think is beneficial for the organizations I work for, right? Like the fact that I was openly trying to manage my social media consumption all of 2020 essentially doubled my following. And then I got to draw those people into my work, which they may not have been exposed to, or my media criticism and analysis. So I think that's, separating who you are and what you do has never been expected of journalists before, right? Like people were very obsessed with their jobs. That's the first thing that we say is like what we do and where we work. So I don't think it's fair to expect non-white journalists to have to make that distinction. I also believe that if you're unsure about tweeting something, that you should put it in a group chat of people you trust that you will most likely not screenshot everything. And if you're really worried about that, there is like 4 people in my life I will just call and say what I wish I could tweet and then get it out of my system. I think those kinds of outlets, that distinction is really, really important for mental health, especially at this point. But going back to what Emma said regarding freelancers, I think the problem is right now there is still too often freelancers as an afterthought in regards to their pay, in regards to their invoicing, their concerns regarding even if a story goes horribly wrong or taken out of context, what happens, because the organization feels less obligated to protect them or to consider what it means to have their byline on this story for forever, basically on the internet. And so I think that's something that often is excused as, oh, we don't have time or money to think about it. We're just trying to keep the lights on. We have all these other issues regarding advertising and falling revenues or dealing with the pandemic and covering coronavirus and the economy. And the thing that is really important is the people who are in the building on a theoretical basis, as long as we work from home, to keep raising that this is important, especially for people like me who used to be freelancers and know what it means that every journalist in the country is a step away from being a freelancer because of a layoff, and reminding everyone that like helping freelancers is also helping other people who were in our positions not that long ago.
All right. Anyone else want to add? No, feeling good. Okay. So we do have about 15 minutes left. So I do want to touch on recommendations for support and how journalists of color in newsrooms, if they don't have support in their newsroom, or they're the only journalist of color there, or they're a very small piece of it, where can they go for support? What resources do you guys suggest for those who need to navigate this kind of stress in these situations?
I actually think Twitter has been a great space for finding like-minded folks to talk to initially. But I think a lot of the things that we've already touched on are really effective. Having a group text with other journalists of color to talk about these things, going to the journalists of color Slack, right? And just also, I think seeking out mentorship in the sense that your mentors could be older than you, but they could also be younger than you or the same age, and just finding spaces to talk to those folks and learn from them as much as you can, and hopefully they learn from you, and it can be sort of a collaborative partnership in that way.
All right, anyone else have suggestions or places you go for stress relief or support?
Karen, get you a Karen.
I send a lot of I've also found it really, really important to find people who give you the space to figure things out. Like in the group chats, like that's the thing, is right now there is a real concern regarding psychological safety and the perception that a lot of people are frankly very tired, but there isn't room for us to make mistakes, because we know as non-white journalists how statistically fewer there are of us, and that retention is a real issue, that there is a scramble of the people who are in the industry want to make it to the point where we're considered for senior leadership, but like there's a gap right now. And so there's a lot of internalized and externalized pressure. And the thing that I try to do is find spaces where we can figure things out in a safe place to talk things out that we're unsure of, bounce ideas off each other that we wouldn't feel comfortable, frankly, tweeting about or talking about in public forums. And then I think it's also really important, I find, that's why I do the reminders sometimes, especially for journalists of color, is to remind people that we are not overreacting and thinking about the burdens that we have, but it's not our sole responsibility. And it shouldn't feel like our sole responsibility to do so. And that's the thing that's really unfair. And so it's really important to do things like balance individual responsibility with also bringing up that there are wider systemic issues that people in power who don't think about hate crimes all the time like we are really should be thinking about to make it easier. I also do stuff like I encourage everyone to sign up for Delia Kai's great newsletter. Like she did something really thoughtful. She's like, okay, I'm very tired, so here are TikToks of like great TikToks that people have suggested and sent in. And so that's what I have done as a stress measure, is I will send close friends just funny TikToks that made me not think about the pandemic for a minute or two. Everyone knows that I send a lot of pictures of my sister's rescue dog. I think spending time doing things to remind ourselves that we are also worthy of rest and recovery, because often that's what we were told in the pursuit of what we had chosen to do, is that we were not worthy of that. And then finally, I think when it comes to Kathleen, your original question, it's really about finding allies, like white people in newsrooms who really are genuinely invested in being on diversity committees and advocating for specific long-term action. And I invest a lot in them to like do these conversations, whether it be education, whether it be parsing through stuff, and also helping them get the time and energy to really, institute change that will help a lot more people. I think that's something that I've also been allowing myself to say no more and be pickier about what kinds of things I participate in. Because I think that's really, really important to protect people's time and energy, because we get asked to do a lot of stuff.
I was kidding, but also not kidding when I said get you a Karen. But the first thing I did after I left my last job is I started therapy, like literally, like I think I quit on a Wednesday and I started therapy on that Tuesday. You know, it was like immediate, and I'm still in therapy. It's great. My therapist reminds me all the time that like it's really important to physically move your body. Like the data is just really, really clear. The two most important things that you can do for yourself is move your body, and that doesn't have to be exercise. It's like anything, you know what I mean? Like I'm not saying go to the gym. It can be a walk. It can be push-ups. I just got a flow board in my living room, so I'm going to learn to surf in my living room. Like it can be anything. And sleep. Like self-care has gotten mutated and bastardized into like sheet masks and all of these other things, but the original iteration of self-care came from Audre Lorde with her dealing with cancer, and it's literally just the basics of taking care of yourself: drinking water, eating a vegetable, doing some movement, and getting some sleep. These are all things that will help your body deal with the stress. And studies have shown that for Black women in particular, we need more sleep. So if the recommendations are 8 hours, get yourself some 9. Like it is okay. Like you are doing the thing that you need. And we need more because of racism. Sorry, that was not clear. I'm not meaning to exclude any other groups. That's just the groups that I have the data on. So.
I just want to throw one more thing out there, because these are all excellent ways to support yourself as JOCs. The one other thing I found really helpful is to lean on your friends who are not journalists to bring you some outside of the industry perspective, because I think journalism as an industry has a lot of problems, and like we've learned it from years of being in it. And sometimes you need friends to be like, I don't understand why that's a thing that you all do. And that really helps sort of change your perspective and break out of this sort of like our entire industry's system of like oppressions and status quos that like some of which we just have absorbed by just being entrenched in it all the time.
It's definitely always fun to be really upset about like a series of tweets or someone on Twitter, and then tell a friend who's not in journalism and have them be like, I have no idea who that is. I don't care. I'll listen to you, but like I don't like that. I don't want to know more.
That's why through the pandemic, at least one day a week, I've gone on top of the mountain, and we're using mountain generously. Usually it's a top hill, where there's no cell reception, right? And so you're just forced to like do nothing, maybe listen to some music if I remember to preload Spotify before I got out there, but basically just walk for like 3 or 4 hours and be left alone with like rambly thoughts. My therapist says zoning out is actually really great for you. So that's my other tip, is zone out.
I was going to add to that. My family does not care about social media whatsoever. They do not care that I have gone viral ever. They do not care. They want to know that I've slept enough and that I'm eating 3 regular meals a day and that I'm no longer losing weight. And that's, I think, really helpful. And that's why a lot of people love pets, because pets do not care. They do not care if we've gone viral or like what social media policies are or deadlines. They're just like, do you want to play with me? The other 2 things that I find really, really helpful is when I feel sad is I donate money, like donate money to AAJA, food banks, diaper banks, Ida B. Wells Society, you know, like up to my donation to the Texas Tribune, you know, various Black charities. Then you feel like, you know, the money is, you're investing in something beyond the feelings that you're feeling temporarily. And then the other thing that I do is I also budget time to help people. I find that's like planting a seed for the future of someone else, because it also gets me out of my own head, and it helps me feel like the struggles and challenges that I have gone to have yielded something positive. And then I make sure that the people that I tell them the people that I've helped. And I also repeat often that if someone has helped me, I try to tell them how that they've helped me and how that advice or their gesture has yielded results. Because often what we as a group do very often is it can be hard to see the yield of our efforts. And so telling someone, you know, like finding out that a referral to like my immigration lawyer that helped stay in the country and help their career is huge. So those kinds of things I find are really helping me, especially during the pandemic.
All right, great. And we have a couple minutes, so we'll do one last question, which I think is actually what all these conversations stem out of. What is objectivity to you? Would anyone like to answer that? No? Too?
Okay,
Right.
I'll say something. Mostly because I'm very inspired by, there was an event, I think 2 weeks ago, where Wesley Lowery talked about this question in particular, in the context of a conversation about like, what does it mean for journalists of color to feel like they can belong in journalism, right? And one of the things, so I'd spent a lot of time recently just being really mad about objectivity, as people may have been able to sense from my answer earlier about how it's like assuming one perspective is what is objective, and everything goes from there. But what Wesley Lowery said 2 weeks ago kind of challenged my sense of that, which I really liked. He said that, theoretically, right, if we remove the reality of the world from this, objectivity as a process is very powerful, which is, if you break it down as like the pursuit of gathering information, right, trying to get at the heart of an issue and then reporting that issue while doing your research, etc. I think that process and goal is really great. And the problem that exists is when you bring objectivity into the real world and you have humans who are fallible attempt to do it. And then that's where a million problems get introduced. He didn't quite say it the way I just put it. He put it better. But that is where objectivity then becomes extremely fallible, because it is so open to interpretation, and also sort of the assumptions that people absorb living in our world today, right? What is objective? What counts as objective? What makes people uncomfortable? What is bias? Because you must be biased because you experience that thing too, and I don't, right? And like, I think now my sense of it is like, yeah, I mean, we don't live in a theoretical world where everybody is rational and that is the way they act at all times. And if we did, I think objectivity could work potentially really well. But because we live in a world in which people have a lot of work to do to even understand at a basic level what it's like to be someone else of a different skin color moving through the world, that there is just like, objectivity is a pursuit that I think can be really dangerous, unless talked about in a very thoughtful, specific way. And sort of the recognition of what it takes in reality to accomplish something like that. And is not as simple as those of us who've gone to journalism school are taught it, like interview 3 sources, quote them correctly. Like it's not that is not the reality, right, of the challenges people face when attempting to be objective.
I think objectivity, the way it's often presented in newsrooms, is like if you have one side of the story, you need to present another side. And taking it outside of the realm of race for a second, that is what has plagued climate reporting for a solid 15 years, which is they took one side says the climate is changing and one side says the climate isn't. But statistically, and like what we knew from the data, is that the overwhelming consensus was the climate was changing and it was human caused. So we were giving a platform to people on the other side for quite some time. And even now in many newsrooms, the climate desk, because it's taking a position, and that position is that climate is changing, it's seen as an activism desk. It's seen as biased in some way, and that colors their ability to cover other issues in many cases, because if you're taking one bias, which is climate change, and you're adding another bias like race or gender to it, that's too much bias for a newsroom, which is bananas, because like the climate is changing, this isn't really up for debate. And yet newsrooms yet accept other things, like we're not, there are flat earthers, but we don't, every time NASA just sent a rover to the Mars, we don't like interview space program denialists to be like, well, did it really get there, right? Like, no, we just sort of accept at this point that there's a freaking rover on Mars and it's awesome, right? So it's the problem with objectivity is like inherent in that discussion is, what is it that we need to bring another voice into, and what is it that we can just take on faith, right? Not even faith, but what is it that we can just take on accepted science, or like, reality that this part of this story is true and we're not going to question it. And the problem is everything that generally isn't questioned is what comes from a white male gaze, right? And then everything else is sort of like has to be proven.
All right, Gabe?
I guess one thing I can add. I think objectivity has gotten to the point where it's such an abstraction, and it's so far from an initial purpose, which was, to be a process, right? To have that theoretical process, that we end up with, newsrooms. And I pick on the Washington Post a lot, but newsrooms say, we value democracy, right? Democracy dies in darkness. Well, it's like, okay, you're in Washington, D.C., where people can't vote for a U.S. senator. So as a newspaper, do you value people's ability to participate in democracy? And the Post doesn't have an answer to that, right, as an editorial guideline. So it's fascinating to me that even at the core level, a lot of outlets seem unable to articulate very clear views about, and I do think journalists should value democracy, right? Like, I do think journalists should be clear that democracy is good, but a lot of outlets seem entirely unable. They seem to need to point out both sides, right? DC should be able to vote, and also I think it shouldn't. And that's really weird. And I don't know why we commit to, well, not me, but I don't think anyone else here, but I don't know why a lot of journalists are still committed to this idea that we can't move on from that place.
To follow up with all of that, and I think Kendra's especially large point, is sometimes there is not two sides to an issue. Like, I love bringing up the fact that, like, for a long time, like, interracial marriage was seen, there was like a literal two sides discussion to like not even gay rights, like interracial marriage within our, like, within people's lifetimes. Like, people are still alive thinking about that you could not marry someone of a different race, and that was illegal. And and the idea now that you could interview someone else about like the purity of a particular race or all these other things, like, I think that, or and with that kind of rationale, like, I think about the same thing now. Like, why is there two sides to things like equal pay for equal work, or like, everyone should have access to clean water? Like, I think those, or where you live should not be a source of cancer causing chemicals. Like, those kinds of things seem pretty no-brainer. And the thing regarding objectivity is it's too hung up being like, oh, we should have this other side. And I think that, especially, I cover economics, there is a lot of theories and research, but like, inherently, even something as simple as like, there should probably be more than one Black female economist at the Federal Reserve determining everything that we understand about our current economy and the way to repair it, like those kinds of things. And then there's all this stuff about pipelines and individual responsibility and retention issues, right? Like I said, I think it's important when Cece was saying, I have friends in economics who are like, it's really bad. You think journalism is bad? It's even worse. So I think that is really, and it's the same thing, right? Like, talking to people in other fields where they have the same hierarchy of like, who's in the top level, who gets no respect, all their own issues regarding race and gender and class, like, I think is really, really helpful. But going back to Kathleen, your original thing, I think it's just about remembering that, like, our definition regarding objectivity is just like everything else in the newsroom. It should be subject to scrutiny and evolution and updates, just like the formats in which we produce journalism itself.
Well, I think that is the perfect place to end. Thank you guys for your time and your contributions. It's a great conversation. I will be putting this recording up on our YouTube channel and sharing it on Twitter and all our lovely social channels. And I will also, for those in attendance, be emailing some resources that we talked about today that our panelists shared with the video out to everybody who registered for this. So you will all get links to everything that we've talked about. So thank you so much for your time, and I hope you guys all have a great week.